Hey, deserving listeners, some of you have been asking me to react to this Paris Jackson interview, Michael Jackson's daughter, with Willow Smith. Let's watch.
Yeah. How has your social anxiety been after this pandemic? Because I know for me, my nervous system has been on an all-time claws out.
It's always been pretty gnarly, my social anxiety. I don't know if you get this too. I experience audio hallucinations sometimes of camera clicks and severe paranoia, and have been going to therapy for a lot of things, but that included, and I've like started EMDR.
Like you hear camera
I'll hear like a trash bag rustling and I like flinch and panic.
Right. So I don't know, but I imagine for Paris, this is related to the traumas of the paparazzi and of the media and what that entails. It's one thing to be chased around with, by people taking pictures of you. That can obviously cause a lot of distress. You're just walking to the mall or walking out of your apartment or something and people are just staring at you. That's one thing. It's another thing when they approach you and they get right up on you and there's, crowds of people and they're all yelling things at you, maybe even barring your pathway so you can't get around. You just imagine that constantly. Not only that, but then people will post pictures of you in compromising situations and then you're humiliated on the national stage. I mean, just imagine. Imagine like if paparazzi were following me around. I just can't imagine what that would be like. And that is traumatic for some people, for sure. And then what she's talking about is she will hear something that will remind her of cameras clicking and she will flinch and she says there'll be hallucinations. So you can, as a part of trauma reactivity, have hallucinations, meaning that you will hear, a war veteran comes back from the theater of war and will hear gunshots, even though they're not really happening, that kind of thing, or hear the screams of their friends dying. It's the mind is trying to work out the memory. The memory is in there, and the mind is trying to heal. But given all the barriers to healing because of stigma, not being able to talk about it, the onslaught of the trauma that's happening all the time, the amount of distress you feel when your mind is trying to remember those things, it can cause these intrusive thoughts and these intrusive experiences that is indicative of PTSD. I don't know if she suffers from that. She did say she went to EMDR, which is usually a treatment for PTSD.
Is that from the paparazzi?
Yeah, I think it's just standard PTSD.
Since the day she was born, Paris has been hunted by paparazzi. As a little girl, she remembers being stepped on as they chased down her father. Not long ago, Paris was harassed and traumatized while simply walking through the airport.
So you think somebody murdered your father?
You guys are like blinding me. I'm really sorry.
Just imagine that. I keep talking about this, but laws have to be put in place for this not to happen. This is just straight up harassment. Straight up harassment. Not okay. Particularly of children, young people. Just not, a politician, you're like, well, you're a politician. But just the daughter of a famous person? Come on.
Back up, everybody. Back up. Paris, what are your thoughts about murder if you die?
Come on, give him a break.
Please stop.
Hey, guys, stop.
Stop.
And then, of course, the paparazzi are like, oh, this is gold. We are the traumatizers of her in this moment, talking about traumas, the death of her father in her face. Do you think he was murdered? She is freaking out, and without any empathy, without any sympathy, without any humanness, they think, I'm quite sure of this is gold. Pictures of Paris Jackson freaking out will get me lots of money. And again, I'll say it just once in this whole video, as I've said in previous videos. The paparazzi don't do this just because they want to. They do it because we click on their pictures. We buy the tabloids. And when we buy, then the money is funneled to encourage this behavior. If we didn't click on those things, if we did not buy those tabloids, this would not happen. There's a reason why paparazzi doesn't follow me around, because no one wants to buy those pictures. So if no one buys those pictures, no one clicks on those links online, then, or no one goes to websites that propagate this kind of nonsense, it'll just go away.
That's abusive
Oh,
to be
100%. I have like nightmares but it's primarily like if I'm out in public during the day. I don't really go out during the day. I do catch it affecting my personal relationships, especially romantic relationships. PTSD can affect pretty much every aspect of your life. I've just like started the healing process. I don't know if you know what EMDR is. I love EMDR. It's very intense and it puts you in a very fragile and vulnerable state, but it is a very effective kind of therapy.
So I've talked about EMDR before. It is one of the available treatments to trauma and to PTSD. There are other forms of therapy. I do not use EMDR. I use other forms. I use a modified, flexible version of prolonged exposure that is similar to EMDR, but not the same. And yes, one of the things that I have found in my research and my clinical work and my experience is that therapy is fairly effective at treating PTSD. We understand it pretty well, at least the clinicians who are trained and get supervision and have a lot of, not every therapist understands trauma very well, but those who do, you can find pretty good success rates. And I hope that people out there, if you do suffer from a trauma reaction, PTSD or relational traumas, know that therapy can help. I've helped people in like 7 sessions with their PTSD where I measure them at the beginning and they have pretty high symptoms, and then by the end of the 7 sessions, no symptoms at all. And then we do follow-ups and no symptoms because we have a treatment protocol that actually is fairly effective and science-based. I've also worked with people for 10 years on complex ongoing chronic traumas that they went through growing up. And so there's various lengths of time that are necessary to treat trauma depending on what's going on.
I really feel like in a lot of my personal relationships, like mostly friendships, that I'm very paranoid about like information.
Right.
Like,
100%.
if I'm telling
everyone
them
that walks into my house signs an NDA.
Yo, like
it's gnarly.
It's gnarly. Like even being like, oh, like delete that text because I don't want people to like.
Oh yeah, it does a lot to your nervous system because you're constantly in fight or flight.
Exactly.
Fight, flight, freeze, collapse. You're constantly like walking on eggshells, constantly looking over your shoulder.
Right. So usually people will say fight or flight, right? That you're faced with a threat and other animals will do this too. And you have a choice between fighting to defend yourself or flight, run away and get away from the threat. But we found that there are other responses too that we need to include in this phrase, fight, flight, freeze. Freezing is when humans and other animals will freeze in the perception of threat that will happen. But then we also have appease. This is another response to trauma. People, particularly who were traumatized relationally and forced to appease the abuser, later on in life, when there's a threat, they will go into an appeasement mode. So that can be another response to threat or trauma that's happening. And it can be very confusing to everyone involved, and mainly the individual, that when someone feels threatening to me, I want to please them and please them and please them, which might include being a victim to their abuse. And then why did I do that? Why did I appease that person? That person was dangerous, but it's because of a learned response when we were growing up. And then the other response we have is faint, and maybe that's what collapse means. So we have freeze, we have fight or flight, freeze, appease, or faint. There might be other nuances to that phrase, but that's the phrase that I use, meaning that for animals such as us, we might just faint under the sight of a threat. Anyway, so this is interesting. I'm glad that Paris is talking about this. And I wonder if with all of the talk of the way that celebrities, particularly women, by the way, are treated by the paparazzi, I wonder if laws are changing or they're going to change, because they really should.
Because some old memories came up. I was like, okay, like I'm going to like sit and be with myself and like do a little prayer. And then I just like felt the need to get up and go into the mirror and start doing these affirmations. And once I finished, I like saw myself, which was wild, and recognized myself for the first time in like 10 years. And I was like, oh, what's up? Hey, old friend. Like it was this really corny moment between me and myself, like in the mirror.
What
and it
did
was
that
just like,
feel like?
I don't have words to describe it. It's so intense. It's just a lot of gratitude.
I will say that Willow Smith is a very good listener. I kind of wish I could talk to Willow Smith, because the amount of empathy that Willow exhibits and the just locked in on what you're saying. I might even show this to my students, because one of the things that novice therapists will suffer from is they're too up in their head and they're not in their heart enough. And Willow is in her heart right now. She's listening. And when I'm observing these trainees that are, in graduate school to become a therapist, they will get so up in their head, and they're terrified usually because they're in the beginning of their career. And they're thinking, okay, what should I say next? And how do I do this? And how do I do that? Instead of just being a human being. And we could watch this because Willow is being a human being. It's very important for therapists to be humans first and technicians second, if that makes any sense. And all of that is within the clinical sphere. And this is kind of a sidebar, I realize that, but to truly listen is to be a very good therapist. A lot of novice therapists that I'm training will say, well, but I'm just listening. I'm supposed to do other things, right? And I say, well, yeah, there are other things that you will be doing, but listening is the very thick foundation of therapy. In order to have a good relationship, in order to make someone feel secure, in order to make someone feel securely attached and safe and heard and understood and able to explore what they want to explore, you have to exhibit extreme superior listening skills, which Willow is exhibiting here.
First start getting into the hang of it.
It just makes me so happy to feel like you see that.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
There are so many people who have suffered from losing loved ones, specifically during the COVID pandemic. How did you find the strength to keep going after losing your dad?
I don't know. It kind of just happened. I was so young that it wasn't like a conscious of, I'm going to keep going.
All right. Well, that does it for that episode of Psychology in Seattle. Everyone out there, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.